So we'll get started. I'll do a few introductions. This is the Accountable Care and Oncology panel. We've heard a lot about ACOs in the general healthcare space. We're going to talk about ACOs in oncology. We have three panelists. Dr. Scott Gottlieb is a practicing physician and resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. And from 2005 to 2007, Dr. Gottlieb served as FDA Deputy Commissioner for Medical and Scientific Affairs, and before that was a senior advisor to the FDA Commissioner and as the FDA's Director of Medical Policy Development. Julian Malinek is the finance lead for the Pioneer ACO and Next Generation ACO models and a technical advisor for financial policy at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Innovation Center. And Ted Okon is the Executive Director of the Community Oncology Alliance. He's a nationally recognized expert on the policy and politics of cancer care and often quoted extensively in the press and makes guest appearances speaking about cancer care and cancer policy. So welcome to the panel. And again, as we just heard, ACOs may be nothing more than dressed up fee-for-service vehicles. But what we agreed, Julian, is that you were going to sort of get started and tell us a little bit about the ACO framework more generally from CMS's perspective, but specifically in terms of oncology, how CMS is approaching this and how you approach your work thinking about incentives and reimbursement and the finances of this model.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, so I'll keep this brief and just give a brief overview of what we're doing at CMS related to ACOs and for oncology in particular. So I work on the Pioneer and Next Generation ACO models as well as the Shared Savings Program. And those models are not specifically, they're fairly broad in terms of the beneficiaries that are attributed to providers in the model. We see a variety of different types of groups and health systems join those models. So there's not sort of a specific focus on oncology or one type of patient in those models, but we try to design them so that a variety of different types of beneficiary panels and providers can join and succeed. A few things to note here. So CMS, you may have seen, there was an announcement from the Secretary. We are really trying to push the envelope on moving towards pay to value for value. So the MACRA legislation gives physicians a 5% bonus if they're participating in an alternative payment model, and that's on all of their Part B services. And so that's sort of like this big carrot in a way to participate in these models. We've set fairly aggressive targets for participation in risk-based models like ACOs and bundled payments in the coming years. So we're really trying to design these models so that they have a business case for a variety of different providers. I'm always struck when I talk to providers and ACOs with the amount of programs and incentive structures that CMS has, from ACOs to bundled payments to a number of different types of programs that incent everything from electronic health record usage to quality reporting. I think we don't always make it easy for providers to sort of understand what we're going for and to comply with all of the various requirements and succeed in our programs. I think the MACRA legislation tries to make that easier by saying sort of there's two paths that physicians can go into, or health systems more generally. They can go into an alternative payment model track or into sort of, if they want to stay in just regular fee-for-service, we're going to consolidate a lot of the quality reporting programs together. In terms of ACOs, what we're trying to do is offer a variety of different types of on-ramps to risk. So I work on the Next Generation ACO model quite a bit, which is starting in 2016, and that's placing basically full risk to provider organizations. The Shared Savings Program, which is it's not part of the Innovation Center where I work, it's a permanent Medicare program, has a lot of ACOs in one-sided risk. And so what we're trying to do is offer a variety of different on-ramps to taking risk, because we realize that, some hospital systems may have an ability to take risk that, smaller multi-specialty physician groups may not. And so we're sort of trying to get providers on in a variety of different, with a variety of different risk-taking abilities. I'm sure you're all aware, and I don't work on this model as directly, although I do work with the team fairly closely on some overlap issues with ACOs, but we have a oncology bundle payment model. And with that model, we realize that oncology practices and multi-specialty practices that have oncology may not be able to take on as much risk as some of our next generation or pioneer ACOs, and so we offer one-sided risk in that model for the length of the model, because we realize that with oncology beneficiaries being very high cost, and with sort of the unpredictability and high cost of various treatments, we don't want to sort of immediately be putting providers into two-sided risk, and we want to give providers an option to stay in one-sided risk. So the oncology model actually allows you to get reimbursed differently and hopefully be paid for things that you aren't paid for now, and be incented in a different way, but not be placed into sort of the aggressive two-sided risk that you see in some of our other ACO models. Another thing I'll speak about a bit is data sharing. So this is something that I work with a lot with our ACOs. In the fee-for-service environment, beneficiaries can go wherever they want, and so that puts a lot of difficulty on coordination of care for the neediest beneficiaries and the highest cost beneficiaries. So what we do in these models, we do it with ACOs. The oncology care model is doing this as well. We share claims feeds, which give historical claims data for aligned beneficiaries. So it's not only your own services, but services for out-of-network or practices that are not your own practice. So I think that's trying to get around this issue of fragmentation in a pure fee-for-service environment that we see a lot in Medicare fee-for-service. I think another thing to talk about, and others on the panel may be able to speak to this in more depth, but we think a lot about the medical home concept. I work with the Comprehensive Primary Care Initiative, which is focused on primary care, but the oncology model also focuses on creating a medical home for oncology beneficiaries, and it pays a care management fee to pay for services not typically reimbursed through fee-for-service. We realize that the fee-for-service environment doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily the best for creating a medical home, so the oncology care model and the Comprehensive Primary Care Initiative pay care management fees, which are just PBPMs. So those are sort of some of the things to think about, just to sort of reiterate the theme. So we're moving towards, value-based payment and ACOs. We're trying to provide a variety of different options for risk-taking. We realize that with oncology, we're not going to just place everyone into two-sided risk. Data sharing is very important and a big benefit of a lot of our models. And then the concept of a medical home is something we think about a lot too. So, I'll leave it at that. And
great. So Ted, lots of different analogies. We've got on-ramps to risk. We've got medical homes. I think in our call you talked about the Homeowners Association, but you represent providers and communities and patients on the ground. How do you see this playing out, these various arrangements?
Well, I think it's really tough to do an ACO when you talk about oncology, because you're talking about, drugs coming out, new drugs, then it's very expensive. And we haven't developed a way yet in terms of dealing with those. One of the concerns that we have with the OCM model, and CMS has made a little movement in that direction, is have it less be about gain sharing. So definitionally, gain sharing is you compete against yourself. And after about 2 or 3 years, you can't compete against yourself and do any better in many cases. So we look at real shared savings and where you're competing against a market basket on a regional or a national basis of similar sort of practices as being the solution. And yeah, what I said, Dennis, is that, the ACO, if you look at it, I live in a neighborhood that, a small little neighborhood, but we have a homeowners association. The homeowners association is basically equivalent to the ACO. You have to go to permission to them if you cut down trees over 2 inches and paint your house and do all of those things. So it's a community of different houses getting together. And The oncology medical home is just that, it's your home. And frankly, I think in oncology, and I feel really strong about this, is that you've got to first look at your own home. And what does that mean? That means actually being able to measure quality, measure value, and then be able to understand how you can compete in a larger ACO framework. Because again, oncology is a specialty that can sort of bust the bank, if you will, in terms of the new, more expensive therapies that are coming out. And I think the interesting thing is, if you look at the Barbara McEnany's Come Home experience, which was a CMMI $19 million grant, guess what? That's based on the oncology medical home. It's working. They decrease costs, they increase value to the patient. And one of the things and I'll bring this down into a real life example, one of the things that they basically did as part of the Come Home model is have a 24/7 care. That's mandatory. So yesterday, before I came up and was on a panel with John Fox and Scott and Kavita Patel for AJMC, that's, I think, Brian, the commercial I'm supposed to give, that when it comes up, everybody's supposed to watch those segments, right? Thank you. But other than that, and this is a true story, I took a family. We had some patients in on Capitol Hill yesterday, and I took a family to Sherrod Brown, Senator Brown. And this is a woman who was a childhood leukemia survivor. She now has breast cancer. She's in active treatment. In fact, on Monday, she's getting her next cycle. Her husband is blind, had his seeing eyes dog, Hershey, around, and they had their little 11-year-old son, Benjamin. And she talked about recently having a problem, knowing that she was really upset that she probably had to get a hydration and antiemetics, and instead of going into the emergency room, guess what? The practice is open 24, in essence has 24/7 availability. On the weekend, instead of going into the emergency room, she was actually treated, was hydrated, and received antiemetics. Think about that for a minute. Instead of going into the emergency room and having this sit there forever and wait, she got right in. Quality of life, a lot better, got treated by the physician or the group that actually treats her. And the other thing is that it wasn't ka-ching, ka-ching, ka-ching for both her insurer and her in terms of going into the hospital emergency room, going into the practice. Well, that practice, State and Physicians, is one of the first practices that was certified as an oncology medical home. COA has been working with the Commission on Cancer in terms of an oncology medical home certification program. So that's a real live, it hit me over the head when I heard that, a real live scenario that this is working. And I'll take one little exception, then I'll hand it over to Scott, is that, in a way, a lot of this stuff is dressed up fee-for-service. But I can tell you on this oncology medical home, both the 7 come home practices, as well as some of the practices that are participating with Mike Cologier's, with Aetna, some of the other pilots, they're actually changing process. And they're actually changing process, and it's actually a win-win in terms of for the payer and for the payer and for the provider. So it's not just your typical fee-for-service, because it is moving into shared savings.
Yeah, so Scott, we got fee-for-service, which isn't much risk from a provider perspective, but we've got an on-ramp to risk. And then you also hear about these other models, bundled payments, episodes of care. So, from your perspective, what is it in terms of this, how much risk, or are we sort of moving to an environment where providers should be taking on risk?
Well, look, I think it's going to be administratively very difficult for CMS to implement the ACO model, particularly in oncology, because of all the complexity that goes into oncology care. And I think it's going to be very hard for them to measure outcomes, measure inputs as well, analyze the data that they're going to have to make this program successful. And that doesn't mean that they're not going to be successful in doing this, but we've seen some early indications that these models are complex and are not necessarily having the outcomes that the agency had hoped for. And I think potentially as these models do falter, and I think they've faltered in certain contexts, what is likely to happen is the agency is likely to fall back on what they've done well when it comes to trying to transfer risk to providers, which is bundling payments. And we had a long debate, and you'll be able to watch it soon, yesterday about whether oncology care is amenable to bundling, and others on the panel, including Kavita, I think Ted to some extent, felt that there were reasons why bundling wasn't why oncology wasn't as amenable to bundled payments as other settings. I think that's not necessarily the case. I think there's settings in oncology where you can bundle the payment and transfer the risk to the provider wholesale, and I think that that's likely what the agency is going to fall back on. They've done it in a dialysis setting. They've unilaterally rolled out a very broad bundle in the orthopedic surgery setting. I recognize these are different clinical care settings, but I do think that the agency is going to be hard-pressed to try to fine-tune all the measurements and collect the data that they're going to need to do in order to make these partially capitated models and the ACO construct work. And you're seeing more and more rhetoric in Washington from individuals who were previously champions of ACOs, who recognized some of the growing pains and some of the challenges with the early rollouts, saying, well, the ACOs really weren't the ultimate model we had in mind. They were an interim step to try to condition the provider community to know how to take risk, and so it's working in that regard. So I think you're already seeing some indication that maybe there's some movement away. I think the problem with these models when you transfer risk in a setting like oncology, it's one thing to transfer risk to providers through a bundled payment in a setting of dialysis where dialysis doesn't benefit from a lot of new technology inputs. It's relatively static, and you can argue the reason why technology in the dialysis setting is relatively static is because of the way it's reimbursed, but setting that aside for a minute, you don't see a lot of innovation in the dialysis space. In a field that's as fast-moving as oncology, where you see rapid innovation and you see rapid adoption of that innovation, reimbursement models that are predicated on backward-looking measures of risk and backward-looking measures of cost are going to inevitably slow down the introduction of that innovation, that technology. I think that's why it's going to be more challenging in this setting than others. And I will say, you listen, and Julie and I think went through a very good discussion of what CMS is doing and these different programs, but you listen to what's going on at CMS, and you have to be overwhelmed, impressed and probably overwhelmed by the complexity of what the agency is trying to do relative to what it's historically done, which was just be a processor of claims. It's trying to be a full-on managed care company that's taking really very discrete steps to try to fine-tune reimbursement based on measures of care, even in excess of what we're seeing necessarily in the private sector. And I think as they walk through these measures and as they impose more complexity onto providers, which is inevitable that this is going to flow down to providers, I do think we're going to see a secular shift of providers out of the fee-for-service Medicare scheme and into Medicare Advantage. And it might or might not happen in the oncology space. Oncologists are different. They're already consolidating around hospitals. There's fewer and fewer individual practicing oncologists. But on the primary care space, at least, you do hear more physicians preferring to throw their lot in with the requirements of a few of the private payers like Aetna and Humana and United, rather than with Medicare. And I think you're going to see more and more providers move their patients into Medicare Advantage schemes. Whichever patients don't come along with them, they'll stop seeing under a fee-for-service scheme if that fee-for-service scheme requires all of these things that Medicare is now imposing as a result of the legislation that just passed on a broad bipartisan basis.
Great.
I think, what some of the problem is that, sometimes I think that on the Medicare side and even on the private payer side, this idea of wanting to sort of bundle in and put the drugs in is really a disguised attempt to shift the responsibility of the payment and the decision-making on the provider. Meaning that if you're only going to get paid so much, and here's sort of the cap in terms of the bundle, then when the latest, newest, greatest comes out, and it's a lot more expensive, it's up to you to make that decision. And I think that is really very tough. I think that puts the provider in a very exceedingly awkward position. And what I'm concerned about is that bundling is not in putting the drug in, is sort of less about, yeah, we need to contain costs, but this makes sense in the context of the patient, and simply more about, well, we don't know how to deal with these high drug prices, even though today, as we speak, there's a forum at HHS that I'm sure they'll all come up with how to deal with the drug prices. But the bottom line is, It's just deal with the drug price. And the other thing is that then we get into the discussion of the drug price. And yes, it is a problem. I tell everybody on the pharma bio side, it is a problem. They got to get a handle on it. But it's not just about the drug price. You know, the drug price is depending if you're talking Medicare or you're talking private insurers. It's 20 to 30% of the slice. So there's a lot other, and then if you look at that pie in terms of the cost drivers of cancer care, it changes in terms of the site of care of where that's delivered. So I think these are really complicated issues, and it goes sometimes about the idea of shifting all of the risk onto the provider of making a decision because you don't know how to deal with some of the, newer therapies coming out and the more expensive those therapies.
Well, I think there's no question that in the technology-intensive fields of medicine, the push towards capitation arrangements and transferring risk to providers is about trying to manage the technology and not trying to necessarily drive efficiencies in the care. And that's not to say that the good-intentioned people at Medicare aren't looking to drive efficiencies in care. So I don't mean to make a pejorative statement here, but I think by and large, the policy prerogative, even in Congress, is to try to impose on doctors the imperative to try to manage the technology. That certainly was the case with dialysis. I mean, they were very transparent about that, and it had the desired effect. EPO use went down, transfusion rates went up, and money was saved.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. In the oncology space, I think it's perhaps more difficult than in sort of just ACOs that have a variety of beneficiaries, right? Because if you have a wide variety of beneficiaries, it'll sort of be a wash generally if the ACO is big enough. But I think, if you're dealing with relatively small oncology practices and very, very high cost drugs, it is difficult, I think, to put people at sort of downside risk. I mean, that's why the oncology bundle model, allows for one-sided risk for the duration of the model. And I think there's sort of a question about that we're currently talking about at CMS about, how much risk is needed to really incent the behavior we're getting at. Is one-sided risk enough? I think that there are people who think it's not, but then for oncology practices, two-sided risk, given all the stuff we're talking about, probably isn't feasible. So
are there lessons to be learned from these other ACO rollouts in the more general population? A lot of the press, I mean, certainly in the Pioneer program, there have been some ACOs that have withdrawn. On the shared savings program, I guess sort of the savings, my read of the news is that it's a little bit mixed. Some issues around sort of attribution of patients and the degree to which providers actually can control patients in their ACO and sorts. So I guess I'm wondering, although we're talking about oncology here, whether there's some kind of lessons that, that CMS has learned that will inform, sort of this new.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we're seeing a little bit is, and the next generation ACO model is just starting with some of these things. So about beneficiary engagement. So in the next generation ACO model, which is sort of the next version of Pioneer, where there's higher risk, beneficiaries can attest to being in an ACO. Sort of, they can get this coordinated care reward, where it's sort of effectively like a lower copay of sorts. And I think we're starting to move towards, I think at first the ACO construct was, let's keep the beneficiary, completely unaware in some sense that they're in the ACO, or let's just, we don't want to do anything that suggests restricting freedom of choice, including, some of the things that I think we might be doing now. So I think there's just a, what I mean by that is not to be glib, but to say that, like, this coordinated care reward is a payment to beneficiaries who utilize a certain percentage of primary care services within the next generation ACO's providers. And I think there's been a progression, and I think we've realized a bit more that, we need to think about beneficiary engagement with the ACO. And so that's sort of, I mean, it's in the context of fee-for-service, so that's a pretty nuanced conversation, but.
So there's been a lot of discussion at this meeting about quality measures and the challenge of quality measures in this space. Not only different cancers, but personalized medicine, targeted therapies. With most of these payment models, whether they're bundles, episodes, or shared risk models, the payment is tied to some threshold or at least some sort of floor level from a quality measurement perspective. I'd like to get your thoughts on, sort of where we're at in terms of quality and performance metrics relative to thinking about these payment models and holding providers responsible for risk.
Well, I can tell you from our perspective, when we set out, I don't know how many years ago, 4 years, 5 years, to look at the oncology medical home, we convened a steering committee of physicians, of payers, and of patient representatives and some other stakeholders. And basically what we did is we set out to look at measurements of quality. And I think, Dennis, the first thing you have to understand is if you look at all the possible quality measures, or at least all the ones that we could pull from every different source and created, there's like about 350. So you have to ask yourself, first of all, are we talking about measuring every conceivable piece of quality generally related without getting into all the permutations and in terms of different cancer types? But the whole idea was to try to get a proxy set, if you will, that you could be able to use in systems and payment models to measure. And the interesting thing is that group, and think of what we're talking about. I mean, now we have a lot better relationships between the oncology providers and the payers. But, the joke was 4 or 5 years ago at the first meeting, everybody had to leave their guns and, knives at the door. I mean, and I hate to, in this environment, say that, but given what's happening in the world, but I mean, there was a lot of animosity and not working together. And frankly, what they did was come up with an initial set of 16 measures. And the interesting thing is we added 3 measures onto that, and just last week the steering committee met and changed one of the measures and decided to lop off one of the measures. So there's 18 now. So it's actually possible, and for good reasons. It had to do with imaging and prostate. There's some reasons around that, won't go into technically. But the fact of the matter is, there is a nice proxy set. And again, it doesn't measure every aspect of quality. That's what 350 measures would do. But it's a proxy set that we think can really, serve as a proxy for the bigger set. And just one thing, with more data and literally being able to measure, having this come out of systems and being able to measure that, we'll eventually be able to tell, if you look at what, the Flatirons of the world are doing, is how representative, how does this correlate with the rest of the measures?
I think the challenge is that the higher up, the further removed from the nexus of the provision of care you try to measure these things, the more sort of distilled down your measures are going to be. And you use the phrase a proxy set for quality. I have a hard time being convinced that 18 measures are encompassing what constitutes quality and delivery of care. I realize that that's a compromise, but that's the compromise that gets made when you're trying to do these things in a very remote location and get political agreement around it and finding things that are actually measurable across a very diverse universe. It reminds me of a discussion I had around the dialysis bundle when I observed that transfusion rates were going up as epogen use declined, and I brought this to some folks at CMS, and they pointed out to me that mortality rates in the dialysis population hadn't budged. And so, there probably wasn't a problem with the rising transfusion rates because they were looking at trends in mortality, and mortality actually had been the same in the dialysis population over the period of time that I was worried about these transfusion rates going up. And that's what they were looking at because that's what they were able to ascertain and measure, but you can argue that mortality is a lagging indicator of adverse changes in the practice of medicine. And that's probably a fair statement. But when you're forced to try to measure these things and draw conclusions in a very remote location far removed from the provision of care, you end up having to distill down your assessments to 18 proxy measures.
Well, I think, Scott, and I hear you and actually agree with you in a way. But the bottom line is sometimes you have to walk before you run. So that, I'm coming at this from the provider side. I'm not coming at it from the CMS or the payer side. And kind of what's interesting about that is I think that, again, we're walking before we run, because I think ultimately when you think about what's happening with pulling some of this, not only the data from the EMR, pulling the unstructured data, as again I said, look at some of the things that Flatiron is doing, I think then you get ultimately into a very different realm of sort of measuring quality. And by the way, I shouldn't shortchange the fact that in addition to those measures, we have a patient satisfaction survey that was built on sort of the CAP survey. So we've had 60,000, close to 60,000 administrations of that survey. And, you know, and I hear you, and I actually agree with you, because you know where I stand on this. It's a step of walking in the right direction to running.
I hear you. You and I probably agree on this. We're having a little healthy debate here. But I mean, the problem is, though, in these policy constructs, when you start to adopt these programs, and people get comfortable with the construct of the program, you never learn to run because you get comfortable crawling. And that's the risk here, that you know, we default to a certain set of proxy measures, we get it in place, and it becomes sort of static and hard to change. And that's been the history of a lot of these programs, including the dialysis program, where it's been hard to sort of accommodate how Medicare is assessing that program and evolve the measures that they're looking at.
Well, you know, one of the frustrating things, though, is on the provider side at the point of care, we're really trying to run, and kind of what's holding us back is on the payer side, is the Medicare, because of the complexity of the Medicare reimbursement system, as well as even some of the payers. Now, you have some progressive payers like United and Aetna have been out there, but I mean, there are a lot of blues across the country that can't even think ground one in terms of you know, oncology reform. So in some cases, we're trying to run with something that we think will work and is actually good patient medicine. I'm not a physician, but good patient medicine, and actually, so works for the patient, it works for the practice. The problem is that the system around us, in many cases, can't move fast enough.
Well, I think where we're going to see this work, and we've seen some models among the private plans that look like they are working. I think that that's where we're going to see these kinds of partial capitation models work, where the plans have close proximity to the practices, understand the local community. I think it's going to just be too complex for Medicare to administer these things. And the question in my mind is, will there be a mass migration into Medicare Advantage, sort of obviating the Medicare Fee-for-Service program before CMS realizes they can't do this and shifts to a bundling arrangement?
So I'm curious, and I think with the quality metrics, I don't work on that piece directly, and certainly not on the oncology care model, but realize that it's quite complex. What do you see as the sort of the main barriers for CMS versus private payers? I'm just curious.
Well, I think that number one is, I think if you look at one of the frustrations a little bit, if you you can go back and tell Ron and Heidi I said this, because I love them both, and they're doing a great job, Ron Kine and Heidi Schumacher. They really are. But I think one of the things is that it gets a little frustrating sometimes when you look at trying to reinvent the wheel. So if you look at aspects of the OCM model, and if you look at what's been out there in terms of quality measures, even if you look at the patient satisfaction survey, I mean, we're a nonprofit organization. Anybody can go up online, throw in a couple bits of information, and you can start using our patient satisfaction survey. And it's built up a cap, so it's nothing. Well, they're looking at a new survey. So you look at some of this stuff, and you say, not only in some cases it's too prescriptive, but, you know, they're looking at this set of, so Scott, you talk about 20, they're looking at a set of 38 measures, and there's some of those measures that really don't really pertain to us when you talk about smoking cessation and things like that as an oncologist, maybe a primary care physician. So I think where some of the frustration gets in is look at what's already been done, look at what's out there, don't try to reinvent the wheel to sort of catch up a program that, you know, is good. We have some problems with it, but it's sort of lagging behind what's also being done there out on the, you know, in the private sector.
So I want to again invite the audience to ask any questions. If you have a question, raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. I think we don't have any shortage of opinions up here on the panel, so I'm sure they'd be happy to answer your question.
No, we're not opinionated at all up here.
Scott, it sounds from some of your comments that you think some of the innovation is going to come from more the private sector, perhaps the commercial sector or the Medicare Advantage. In other words, that's where you know, we'll get more from crawling to running quicker, if I understood you correctly. And I'm wondering if you might, you know, sort of forecast into the future of what some of that innovation might look like, where you know, where the more innovative organizations, what they'll look like in terms of both taking on risk, managing patient populations, and regardless of whatever set of quality measures there is, ultimately deliver value to patients and to payers.
Right. Look, I think we're seeing it. You see some of the private payers engaging in innovative models with all providers, but in particular oncologists. You saw the program that United had. So I think that there is innovation in the private sector. I think it's going to be hard to do this at the level of a Medicare program, at the level of a government agency. And, these things end up getting litigated in a political context. The measures end up getting adopted in a political context where there's a lot of constituencies engaged. That's why it's hard to arrive at sort of a consensus set. I think the Medicare Agency itself is very remote from the provision of care. It has a hard time measuring and doing the assessments. It hasn't historically been asked to be a payer. It's historically been a processor of claims. It's only in the last maybe 10 years that Medicare has really started to evolve into doing the traditional work of a payer, and just doesn't have the legacy of engaging in those kinds of activities. It's obviously made a lot of progress, probably in the last 2 administrations, moving into these realms, but I think at the end of the day, this is going to be very hard for the agency to administer, and if they do it, I think it's going to impose such excessive burdens on providers that it's going to chase them out of these programs to the extent the providers can escape.
And to sort of lop on that, you talked about, Scott, before, the idea that we talked about this yesterday with Kavita and John Fox, that there are certain types of cancers right now that you can look and you can say you can bundle. And I agree with you. As we talked yesterday, I think one of the problems is, and this sort of goes right to your comments, that the Medicare system is so big. I mean, and I know ill will intended, but it's so big. That Medicare doesn't have the ability to take and do 1, 2, or 3 of those types of cancers, as, for example, United and Aetna or someone on the private sector can do, and literally have 2 different systems. And that's even hard enough with some of the big payers, but with Medicare, I think it's impossible. It's a black and white proposition. They're either going to bundle everything or not bundle anything, and in between.
So you're saying they can't carve out certain settings of care, certain cancer types?
I think it makes it very, very tough.
Certainly certain settings of care they could. I mean, we agree radiation oncology.
Yes, absolutely. But see, to me, that's different than, I was thinking, for example, medical oncology. I think you can do radiation oncology, for example, but when you look at medical oncology and you talk about specific drugs.
A bundled rate for stage 1, stage 2 breast cancer.
I think it becomes really tough. I think at best you can do demonstration projects, but they take almost an act of Congress to get a demonstration project, and then
not anymore.
Get it done.
You just do it under CMMI and roll out nationally,
we have a question,
and you call it a pilot.
We have a question from the audience in the back here.
I mean, that's what the innovation center is there.
Go to the question here.
I was so engrossed by the conversation, I forgot my question. Scott, you talked about Medicare pushing towards ACOs and then backing off and going towards a bundle. It's interesting in the oncology care model that it's almost like a mini ACO, because not only do they say all cancer and all cancer types, they also say all costs associated for that patient. And Medicare has made it a little bit easier in the first couple of years, because they've said you only can gain, you can't lose. But do you think that's a viable model to put oncologists at risk for the total cost for that patient and not just the oncology costs?
Yes. So I mean, I can speak to that. I think so. In our view, I think there is a lot of parallel between bundled payments and ACOs, right? The bundled payment tends to be a shorter period of time, right, and sort of for specific conditions. But I mean, in terms of total cost of care risk, so I think that's the construct that we use in across the bundles and ACOs. I mean, I can't speak as much to whether it's appropriate or not to do that, but I think we're offering one-sided risk to oncology practices to sort of allow them to join and wade into it slowly before being at downside risk, or they could be at one side risk the whole time if they wanted to. I don't know if others have thoughts on that question.
What's the I was going to ask you a question.
Yeah, good.
I was going to ask you, the Secretary came out with a pretty sort of bold initiative to try to move towards risk-based arrangements by a certain date, a certain amount of payment through these risk-based arrangements by a certain date. And I think a lot of folks on the outside said, wow, that's going to take a lot of work to actually achieve the goal. How much is there a palpable sense inside the agency that you need to move quickly, that the agency is pushing towards that goal and it's achievable?
I think there's a lot of momentum. I think the MACRA legislation that was this bipartisan piece of legislation, which was a fairly, I think, big deal, and sort of at CMS, I mean, the health policy community in general, that happened. But that's giving a bonus to join these risk-based models. So I think there is a lot of momentum. And as I sort of said earlier, at the same time, I think we're trying to be careful about, giving people options in terms of the amount of risk they want to take on. So it's a balancing act. I mean, I know perhaps, or in talking with some people in the private sector, I know there's some skepticism about whether we can meet that.
I wasn't casting skepticism. I just wanted to see. I was asking more sort of culturally, your insight. What's the mood like? What's the sense of urgency? Because we're not there.
Yeah, there's a sense of urgency, I would say.
So, any other questions from the audience? Feel free to raise your hand. Ted, maybe I'll direct this to you, but the others may comment. I mean, under the assumption that eventually more risk is going to, we might argue about the speed, that the providers are going to be sort of asked to take on more risk and manage patient populations. What do you see sort of among your constituents? How are they preparing for this? What are they doing from whether it's from a business management perspective, sort of integration, team-based care delivery perspective, thinking about quality of care? How are, those on the ground, preparing, I assume, for what's coming?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think some practices our dentists are basically understanding their data better than ever and trying to do that. Again, they're doing some interesting things and pulling the data out and looking at that. I am really skeptical from the standpoint that the 800-pound gorilla in the room is when basically a new drug gets released. And again, what happens there is there's not this sort of global look. I mean, look in the press. No one says, okay, this drug gets released, what is the ramifications on the, if you look at Medicare, it's Part A and Part B collectively, what's it do in terms of hospitalizations, what's the global consideration? And so the problem is we silo these things. So that when you have a new therapy, you have a new drug that's released, and it's obviously standard of care, but it's more expensive. Again, how do you deal with that? Does the physician not give it and disadvantage the patient? I mean, it's almost would be malpractice. Or does the physician jump up and give it, and all of a sudden, has to give back money under a risk model? So I think until we look at these things more globally, and we put the drugs in the consideration of the global piece as well too, I think it's really tough. And even though I know we look at a lot of the ACO and some of the models and say it is global, it's not. It is siloed in a way, because it's even just taking into consideration the cost of treating that patient, not the global costs around that patient. So I hate to say it, I'm usually a positive person and looking forward, but this is a tough one.
Yeah, I'll just say I've been surprised by the pace of consolidation underway in oncology, and the fact that the administration and Medicare, for that matter, have tolerated it and sort of expanded some of the things like the site of service pay differentials and the 340B programs. There's things that were contributing to the consolidation, either deliberately or inadvertently, and I'm left wondering how much of the tolerance for the consolidation, which is clearly increasing costs, and you can argue is changing the sort of complexion of medical care, if not lowering the quality in certain situations. How much of that was tolerated because it was seen as a precursor to conditioning the provider space to take this risk? I mean, you have to consolidate the doctors into functional units capable of taking risk before you can transfer risk to them. If I was, Machiavellian and trying to design deliberate policy, this is genius.
Right.
I mean, I would say though that there's a variety of different ACOs, and I mean even in the most high risk pioneer ACOs or next generation ACOs, there's physician only organization, there's primary care organizations, right? So I think, and I think about this issue a fair amount. I don't work on it as directly, but I think it's a key issue for ACOs. I mean, I think ACOs get a lot of the blame for consolidation, and certainly there's a variety of pieces, but...
I wouldn't blame the ACOs for consolidation. I would say the ACOs are a beneficiary of consolidation. Yeah. That's how I would frame it.
I mean, so I think practices, there are some, an ACO is this new construct that, if people want to form it, they have to form together. I would just point out that I think there's a variety of different types of ACOs, right, from physician organizations
Yeah, but you can argue, and maybe this is unfair, but my perception always was that there were some biases built into the way they were constructed, at least in the early iteration, in favor of hospital ownership of ACOs, because there was requirements, for example, of physical control of the IT infrastructure, things that a disaggregated group of medical practices coming together virtually to try to form their own ACO and take risks, things that they couldn't necessarily do. Now, I think there's been changes in the way the regulations have been written. I think there's been provisions put in MACRA to try to enable the more virtual type of integration, but at least in the early iteration, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was a perception that it was biased in favor of sort of consolidated entities that had physical ownership of their infrastructure.
So Julian,
Well,
go ahead, Ted.
No, I was just going to say, look, if you look at the oncology space, anybody who's seen the tracking that we do, the map that we do, it looks totally like the Verizon or AT&T coverage map. It's got so many dots over it, which represent consolidation of care in this country, and clinics that have closed and into the hospital setting. I actually go a step further, and I know you think this too, Scott. I go a step further that I believe, frankly, the administration wants to consolidate everything into large health systems. I think, that's where some of the push is on it's late, it's Friday, my political,
Want me to save you from yourself?
No, I'm going to make it even worse. But I think that they want to consolidate, and I think we've seen that. I think we've seen massive consolidation. And I think that when you mentioned it, Scott, I think when you see the fact that if you go into an outpatient setting and in a hospital, and you go into a independent community cancer clinic, and look at the payment for the first hour of chemotherapy administration, they're vastly different. It's higher in the hospital. It's documented all over the place. Care is higher in the outpatient hospital setting. When you look at 340B, and you can take the typical oncologist that accounts for $4 million worth of drugs a year on average, depending on what cancers they treat, and a 340B hospital can make $1.2 to $4 million off of that oncologist. They're going to do everything they possibly can to bring that oncology business in, whether it's to put the practice out of business, buy the practice, or consolidate it. So I think we're seeing that consolidation. And the irony of that consolidation is it's driving costs up. It's driving costs up as we go, and we're seeing that. It's part of the reason why we're seeing Medicare beneficiary, Part B Medicare beneficiary premiums go up and had to be rescued recently with the budget bill. It's tough. So I think that until we look and get real about this, there is going to be more consolidation. Now, the saving grace and the good news is that practices have got together, and that's allowed them to basically not necessarily bear more risk now, but be a lot more innovative, because they're literally fighting for survival and their patients, in some cases survival, to keep rural areas open, but it's allowed them to do that. So we look at, you look at Florida Cancer Specialists, 180 oncologists. They're doing some incredible things down there, including even phase 1 research. Look in what's happening in New Jersey with Andy Pecora's group, and look around the country, and you see some of that. That's healthy to me, because those practices are doing some innovative things. What's not healthy to me is the care that gets consolidated into the hospital system. Scott and I both live in Connecticut, and what's called JAWS in Connecticut is known also as Yale. They've bought everything up in the entire state. So, and by the way, little held secret, my wife works for Yale.
So Julian, you work on the technical side of this, thinking about sort of the long-term strategy and sort of how to provide the correct incentives if there are such things. But ultimately, I think what a lot of these models purport to do is to allow providers to better manage, sort of things that they can control, not things they can't control. Ted raises this issue that there's a big elephant in the room, which is the thing that is very difficult to control, drug pricing. So I'm kind of curious, as you think about, sort of these models and sort of going forward, maybe I'll just sort of phrase it this way. Do you try to project, distinguish, or in any way, think about the things that are in the control of the providers versus those that really aren't, per Ted's point?
I mean, we do think about that a lot, absolutely. And I think, we often talk about trying to reduce hospitalizations and things, and I think sometimes we don't talk about drug costs as much as perhaps we should. I think in the oncology space, obviously, it's very important to talk about that. I mean, I think that we have provisions in our models to try to protect against sort of very high cost events. So for instance, in the Pioneer, NextGen, and Shared Savings Program, beneficiary expenditures are capped at the 99% level sort of nationally. So a lot of beneficiaries who are very high cost are sort of going to hit that cap. And above that cap, then you're not sort of at risk, right? So we try to put provisions in place to protect against very high cost events. I think I think Ted's point is a fair one, right? That these are things that I think there's beyond sort of the design of ACOs, there's other sort of regulatory activities that need to be involved in sort of looking at these things and access to drugs. So I mean, I'm in agreement with that. I think it is something we think about a lot. I think we think about how does Part D interact with our for Pioneer and Next Generation and Shared Savings Program. These are total cost of care A and B models, so they don't include Part D. And so is there sort of how do you think about Part D given that, right? So we're trying to sort of work through that now. It's a difficult thing because Part D is quite fragmented. Obviously, a lot of the drugs that we're talking about for oncology are not in Part D, but
sure.
Yeah. So
but CMS has made overtures to look at ways to try to incorporate Part D spend. Can you speak to that a little
absolutely. Yeah.
It's in the LCM model, even, that
Right.
pulling in the Part D piece.
Right. So we've looked at that. I think, one thing that's challenging there and that, we're having conversations about is just the fragmentation of Part D. So, if we want to pull in Part D, we want to sort of make sure that we're not sort of pulling ACOs into something that they just don't have any real control over. So I think we're trying to think about, how do we think about ACOs and Part D, given that there's, so many different plans. I mean, obviously I think they're, so it's something we're thinking about, but it's not sort of.
So we have just a few minutes left. What I'd like to do is wrap up by giving you each maybe a minute and a half, 2 minutes, just really to close with whatever you want. It could be what's going to keep you awake for the next couple years, advice to the to policymakers, or some of the key concerns among your own constituents, and sort of let you close with some final comments. So Scott, maybe I'll start with you, and we'll just go down the row.
I'll just close as a provider, and I'm a primary care provider, and I practice as a hospitalist, but I think there's been a real erosion in Medicare fee-for-service, in part because of the reimbursement hasn't kept pace with the cost of care and the technology, and in part I think because of the increased complexity that's been imposed on providers through the fee-for-service arrangements. And you look at the context of MACRA and all of these risk-bearing arrangements, and all of the complexity and all the sophistication that provider groups are going to have to take on to comply with a lot of these provisions. And I do think that you're going to see a migration, I made this point earlier, into Medicare Advantage and away from fee-for-service. The question in my mind, we've seen sort of the fee-for-service getting to be a smaller and smaller component as Medicare Advantage continues to grow. And the question in my mind is, what will inflect first? Will fee-for-service shrink small enough that Medicare will no longer try to micromanage it? or will physicians migrate out of fee-for-service into Medicare? Are the patients going to leave first, or are the doctors going to leave first, and where's that inflection going to happen? But I do think that you're going to see that play out over the next 5 years.
I think it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with some of these models, especially related to the oncology medical home. And really the OCM model, they didn't use the word oncology medical home, but it's really an oncology medical home in disguise. And I think that if you look at it, it's going to be really interesting to see, can these actually be adopted by the payers? Can Medicare make it work? And because I think at the end of the day, frankly, if they don't, then I think it's going to be very hard even for the largest practices, independent practices, to end up not in the hospital and see a tremendous consolidation of cancer care. But I think right now it's kind of exciting, and it's really neat that when you look at community oncology, and I say this obviously with a bias, but I challenged a reporter to go look at any other area of medicine and say, who's doing as much innovating specifically as oncology and specifically community oncology? She came back 3 days late because she got ticked off that I said that, so she came back 3 days later, did her homework, and said, you know what, you were right.
So, so I agree with Scott about the complexity of Medicare fee-for-service, and I think, what I sort of think about a lot and, worry about is, how do we balance providing a variety of different options for instance, with risk, for, systems that can take on a lot of risk versus provider groups that can't. How do we do the various things that Medicare cares about, or that are in legislation, things that we want to test without sort of creating an overly cumbersome and incredibly complex fee-for-service environment. So that's sort of what I think keeps me up. And I think the progression for ACOs with MACRA, it'll be really interesting to see the uptake. I think we're working really hard to provide ACOs with the right incentives and a variety of options. I'm very excited about the oncology care model as well. I think it'll be a really interesting test to see how oncologists respond to the incentives and the things that we're offering in that program. So there's a lot going on at Medicare and in the Innovation Center where I work, and more broadly. So these next few years are going to be pretty exciting for us. So.
Great. So I'm going to invite in a moment Brian to come and close the meeting, but before we do, there was certainly no shortage of candidness for the panel, and I appreciate that. And so let's thank Scott Gottlieb, Julian Malinek, and Ted Oken for an excellent panel.